Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the vast ocean of information and distill it down to the essential, fascinating insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're embarking on a journey that it really forces us to look inward and ask a pretty fundamental question. How much of what we think of as our most personal, fundamental truth, our sexuality, is actually a product of history, culture, and, well, power?
That's the big question, and the core premise we're exploring today, based on this really complex set of sources, is startling.
Really is.
The idea that sexuality, that core part of your identity, who you desire, is actually a relatively modern invention.
And we have to be clear here. We're not questioning whether people in the past had sex, obviously.
Of course not.
But whether the concept of being a type of person, of being categorized based on those desires, has always existed.
That is the crucial distinction we have to get our heads around. Our mission today is to explore this huge stack of historical and philosophical texts that detail how the very meaning of sex has been conceptualized.
And it changes dramatically.
It's a total transformation. We're moving from a framework of status and political performance in the classical world to one of internal sin and morality in the religious age, and then finally to biology, science, and identity politics in our modern world.
And the initial paradox that really sets the stage for this deep dive is just incredible. The sources describe ancient Greece and Rome as existing in a world before sexuality.
Imagine that.
I mean, our world is defined by these categories: heterosexual, homosexual, and a growing spectrum of others. But for the Greco-Romans, classifying a person by the gender they desired would have seemed,
according to one classicist, downright bizarre.
Bizarre.
A concept that's so central to your sense of self, who you're attracted to. It just didn't function as an organizing principle for their society, their law, or even their personal identity.
So to unpack this, we're going to trace this evolution through three core models.
That's right, the classical social framework, then the Christian religious moral one, and finally the modern biological scientific one. These three lenses have fundamentally shaped how we experience desire.
Okay, so let's begin in classical Athens and Rome. To really grasp this world before sexuality, we have to start with how they even thought about desire itself.
Right, and for that we have to turn to philosophy. Specifically to Aristophanes' famous story in Plato's Symposium.
This is a great place to start.
It's the perfect myth because it tackles the origin of desire head-on. So Aristophanes tells this story of original humans who were these perfectly spherical creatures. They were complete, powerful, and frankly, arrogant.
So Zeus decides to humble them.
He splits them in half, turning them into the two-legged humans we are now. But, and this is the key part, those original spheres came in three genders.
Right, there were the all-male spheres, the all-female spheres.
And the androgynous ones, which were half male, half female.
And so the resulting halves are now doomed to wander the earth, looking for their other half, their complement, to feel whole again.
Exactly. And the story suggests this desire is innate and specific. Men who pursue men came from the all-male sphere, women who pursue women from the all-female one, and men and women who pursue each other, well, they came from the mixed one.
So on the surface, that sounds a lot like a theory of innate sexual orientation.
It really does. But here's the profound philosophical twist you have to remember.
Okay.
Aristophanes was a comic poet. He wrote plays about talking birds and women taking over the government. So many classicists view this myth as, playful, maybe ironic, or even absurd.
So we shouldn't take it as a literal scientific theory of the time.
Exactly. The key takeaway for our deep dive is this. Even though the myth suggests that, yes, innate same-sex desire existed, the Greco-Romans did not organize their identity around who they desired.
So the feeling was there, it was recognized, but the social structure just didn't care about it when it came to defining who you were as a person.
Precisely. Because their moral preoccupation was entirely centered on sexual practices.
On the act itself.
On the act and on the social status of the people involved. It was about what you did and who you did it to, not who you fundamentally were.
And that is the huge chasm separating their world from ours.
It's everything. Sexual morality was regulated, yes, but through this really inflexible lens of social and political status.
And you have to picture the context, right? Athens was this limited democracy run by a small elite of adult male citizens. And they held all the power over women, children, foreigners, slaves.
Everyone else?
So their sexual culture was built, first and foremost, to reinforce that dominance.
Absolutely. Which brings us directly to what the sources call the phallocentric ethos. For the ancients, sex was defined almost exclusively as penetration.
Just that one act.
Pretty much. Other things, kissing, caresses, those were expressions of love, philia, or pleasure. But if they didn't involve penetration, they weren't really considered sex in the way that mattered socially or legally.
That definition alone, that sex is penetration, that makes the act inherently non-relational, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not a shared experience reflecting emotional intimacy.
No, it wasn't about collaboration. It was about demonstration. It was something one person did to another, often to show domination, to publicly perform their status as a citizen.
So the satisfaction or consent of the other person
was, by and large, irrelevant to the moral calculation of the act. The whole thing just reflected and reinforced the existing power relations of their society.
And this is where it gets incredibly clear. The fundamental moral line was drawn between the active, penetrative role,
which was associated with the male citizen, with power, with status.
And the passive, submissive role?
Precisely. And for a freeborn man, being in that submissive, penetrated role was profoundly demeaning. It was social suicide.
Why?
Because it reduced him, in the public's eyes, to the status of a woman or a slave. The act of receiving penetration could literally destroy his claim to being a full male citizen.
So penetration was acceptable with anyone who wasn't a full citizen?
Women, boys, foreigners, slaves, all were considered proper objects of penetration.
The scholar David Halperin summed this up as an ethos of penetration and domination. It just completely conflated the sexual, the political, and the social.
And this played out brutally in public life. Accusations of sexual impropriety weren't just insults.
No, they were political weapons.
Powerful ones. They could lead to civic death. If you were accused of being penetrated, or worse, engaging in acts they considered even more degrading, like fellatio or cunnilingus,
you could lose your citizenship.
You could lose everything.
Hang on. Why were fellatio and cunnilingus seen as even worse?
Well, the sources are quite specific. There was a clear hierarchy of shame. Cunnilingus was generally seen as the most debasing act, followed closely by fellatio.
But why?
Because using the mouth was seen as the most extreme form of sexual subjugation. It was a status violation that went beyond simple penetration. These were acts strictly reserved for people whose status was already at the bottom, like prostitutes or slaves, because it couldn't damage them further.
That is just a world away from how we think now.
It's a completely different logic. And it shows how status completely trumped gender. If the power dynamic was correct, if you were the dominant penetrative party, the specific gender of your partner was, kind of a secondary detail.
Okay, let's connect this to how they saw the body itself, because that's a key piece of the puzzle.
It is. The classical world operated under what scholars call the one-sex model. This was based on the medical philosophy of the time from people like Galen.
And this model didn't see male and female bodies as fundamentally different.
Not at all. They were seen as variations on a single spectrum. Bodies were thought to be made of these fragile liquids and heat, all held in a very precarious balance.
Men were the ideal form, active, hot and strong.
And women were the imperfect version, passive, weak, damp, and cold.
So gender was fluid, in a way.
Very much so. A man could risk feminization by losing his vital body heat and energy.
And how would he lose that heat?
Mostly through excessive sex and ejaculation, or by taking the passive receptive role in a sexual act.
So masculinity wasn't a biological certainty. It was this constantly threatened identity that you had to maintain through aggressive performance and self-control.
Exactly. And a man's failure to perform sexually, his flagging lust, was seen as this huge, humiliating failure. It was a common theme in their comedies.
And all this instability, this anxiety, it was all projected onto women.
Yes. Women were seen as naturally oversexed, as these inferior creatures who lacked a man's capacity for self-control. There's the myth of Tiresias, who lived as both a man and a woman and said female pleasure was far more intense.
So female desire was seen as dangerous.
Very dangerous. A voracious woman could exhaust a man, literally turn him into a woman by robbing him of his vital heat through too much sex. The whole culture was built around this core anxiety of maintaining those gender boundaries.
And inside this system, you have the practice of paiderastia in Athens, the relationship between an adult man, the Erastes, and an adolescent boy, the Eromenos.
Right. And this was socially acceptable, but only because it was framed as this educational mentoring relationship. It was about preparing the boy for his future role as a citizen.
But the rules were incredibly strict.
The rules were all about status. The adult man had to be the penetrator to maintain his status. The boy, who was a future citizen, was expected to submit, but only out of philia friendship and respect for his mentor.
And the most critical rule of all.
The boy must not experience sexual desire or pleasure himself.
Why was that so important?
Because if the boy seemed too eager, or if he actually enjoyed it, it would open him up to accusations of being feminine or shameless. It would suggest he had an affinity for the passive role, which would undermine his entire future as a dominant male citizen.
So the whole practice, even that, was just another way to reinforce the dominance ethic.
It all comes back to that.
And as a visual reminder of this, sexual imagery was everywhere. We're talking about the erect phallus being a common symbol.
It was ubiquitous. A symbol of power, fertility, a charm against evil. You'd see it on temples, on houses, on everyday objects.
There's the example of the winged phallus from Pompeii.
A fantastic example. This wasn't hidden away in a bedroom. It was a public, decorative object for home protection. For them, the erect phallus was an emblem of the active, dominant male citizen. Its presence everywhere just underscores that sex wasn't private or shameful. It was deeply political.
It's just a fundamentally different way of seeing the world.
Completely. And from this world, we make a radical shift to an entirely new moral universe.
We do. We now face this huge conceptual leap. The classical world cared about external status and performance. The Christian world cares about your internal soul.
Your moral intent, your relationship with God. And Christianity puts sex right at the center of morality by declaring it the original sin.
This is the pivot, and it's most powerfully articulated by St. Augustine in the early centuries AD.
Absolutely. By saying that sex, or the desire that drives it, is the reason for the expulsion from Eden, Augustine completely changes the source of sexual activity.
It's no longer about the body's heat, like the ancients thought.
No, now it's produced by this internal sinful desire that he called concupiscence.
And that is a monumental change. Sex is no longer just a social act. It's a profound moral weakness. Intercourse itself is now tainted by original sin.
It marks a victory of the corruptions of the flesh over your moral willpower.
And look at how this changes the meaning of the phallus. For the Greeks, the erect phallus was a proud symbol of power.
Right. In the Augustinian view, the phallus now incarnates man's enslavement to that concupiscence. It's not a symbol of dominance anymore. It's a symbol of the fallen state, a sign that the body refuses to obey the rational will.
So the entire Christian project, especially early on, becomes about spiritual salvation, about freeing yourself from worldly, carnal desires.
Precisely. Celibacy, purity, these are the highest virtues. Sex, even within marriage, is viewed with deep suspicion and needs to be policed. You can feel the internal struggle in Augustine's famous prayer, "Give me chastity and continence, only not yet."
So because sex was now this central moral problem, the church had to find a way to manage it, which leads to this kind of ambivalent acceptance of marriage.
Marriage becomes the necessary second-best option for the majority who can't be celibate. But it's only acceptable if procreation is the main goal.
Sex for pleasure is out.
Out. The partners owed each other the marriage-get intercourse for the purpose of having children. Anything else was suspect.
And this focus on procreation made consummation legally and socially critical.
Yes, if a marriage wasn't consummated, it wasn't legitimate. It became grounds for divorce, which was formalized in canon law around 1140 AD.
And the need to prove this led to the church courts intruding into the most private parts of people's lives.
We have these truly unsettling accounts from the 15th century courts of York and Canterbury. They detail the legal examination required to prove a man was impotent.
Tell us about that, because the description is just remarkable.
Well, the process often involved a panel of midwives and sometimes honest women who were literally tasked with trying to physically stimulate the man to an erection.
In a public court setting.
In a supervised setting. One account describes a man's penis as scarcely 3 inches long, remaining without any increase or decrease during the whole ordeal.
That's just incredibly humiliating.
It's deeply humiliating. But it shows how the state, through religion, was now mandating sexual performance for the sake of social and theological order. Failure wasn't just a personal problem anymore, it was a moral and legal one.
And the ultimate expression of this anxiety over lust becomes the concept of sodomy.
This huge catch-all sin that policed all non-procreative sex.
So unlike the classical system where status mattered most, The Christian system only cared about the purpose of the act.
That's exactly it. The only legitimate purpose was procreation. Anything that diverted sexual energy away from that was unnatural and sinful.
And sodomy covered a lot of ground.
It covered everything. Until the 18th century, it was the generic term for bestiality, masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, sex between men, sex between women.
And even sex between a husband and wife if they were trying to avoid conception.
Exactly. Any unnatural act.
But the sources also point out some historical contradictions. The historian John Boswell made this controversial claim about sanctioned male-to-male unions in early Byzantine societies.
Which is a great reminder that attitudes were never uniform. But by the High Middle Ages, the condemnation was strong, though how it was enforced varied dramatically. Take Renaissance Florence.
Which had a reputation for these relationships.
It did, and in response, they set up the Office of the Knight in 1432 specifically to prosecute sodomy.
And the numbers are staggering. Something like 17,000 men were investigated over 70 years.
Out of a population of 40,000. It's a huge proportion of the male population.
So what does that tell us?
It suggests the behavior was widespread, and the state felt it had to do something. But, and this is key, most of those investigations ended with just a light fine.
So it was a kind of public performance of morality.
It seems like it. The authorities show they're upholding Christian virtue, but they avoid mass executions that would disrupt society.
Which is very different from other places.
Drastically different. In other parts of Europe, Geneva under Calvin, for instance, the punishments were beheadings, burning at the stake. But the moral category was set, and over time, the focus of the word sodomy started to narrow, increasingly targeting acts between men, which paves the way for the next huge shift.
From sin to sickness.
Exactly. The Enlightenment brings in a new organizing principle. Science, reason, biology. Religious dogma is replaced by scientific models.
But the practice of introspection, of policing desire, that doesn't go away. It just gets secularized.
That was Michel Foucault's great insight. The irony is that Christianity defined sex as shameful, but it also created the confessional, this institution that demanded you talk about it.
Right, you had to confess your darkest desires to be saved.
And in modernity, that practice just migrated to new fields. Medicine, therapy, law. We became, as he put it, a singularly confessing society. But the goal was no longer salvation. It was diagnosis and correction.
And the perfect example of this shift from sin to sickness is the obsession with masturbation.
Yes. The sin of onan becomes a medical condition. And this was largely kickstarted by a single anonymous pamphlet in 1712 called Onania.
And this pamphlet had a huge impact.
Its power can't be overstated. It was written by a quack, but it successfully reframed the act. It wasn't just a sin anymore. It was a medical problem, a disease caused by ignorance. And of course, the author was happy to sell you the expensive cure.
And this kicked off a mass panic that lasted for more than a century.
Oh, a huge panic. Self-abuse was suddenly blamed for everything: blindness, madness, epilepsy, impotence, and this invented disease called spermatorrhea, the debilitating loss of semen.
And the fear led to some truly bizarre and brutal interventions.
This is where we see the emergence of those shocking Victorian anti-masturbation devices. These weren't just ideas, they were real products people bought and used.
Tell us about some of them.
Well, there were chastity belts for both men and women, designed not to prevent infidelity, but self-abuse. For men, there was the four-pointed urethral ring, a metal device inserted into the urethra to make an erection painful.
That's horrifying.
It is. There were also these complex electric shock machines designed to deliver a jolt to the genitals the moment someone attempted the act. It speaks to a society that was genuinely convinced this private act could destroy a person's sanity and health.
And this whole atmosphere sets the stage for the birth of sexology at the end of the 19th century.
Right, the science of sex. And now, sex is firmly located in nature and biology. Moral judgment is replaced with categories of disease and degeneracy.
But this required a whole new way of thinking about the body. The old classical one-sex model was replaced by the modern two-sex model.
A hugely important shift. Men and women are now seen as fundamentally biologically different creatures, different organs, different hormones, different natures, and this becomes the scientific justification for having separate social roles.
And it leads directly to the pervasive double standard we still see traces of today.
Absolutely. Male sexuality was seen as aggressive and biologically driven. Female sexuality was defined as passive, chaste, and purely for reproduction.
The physician William Acton famously said, "The majority of women are not much troubled by sexual feeling of any kind."
The Victorian ideal. So consequently, if a woman did show strong sexual urges, she was seen as medically abnormal.
which led to the diagnosis of female hysteria.
Hysteria became this catch-all term for any non-normative female behavior, from irritability to sexual desire. And the treatments were severe, ranging from manual massage to orgasm by a doctor, all the way to clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris.
And this process of categorization leads to the most defining moment of the modern era, the creation of fixed sexual identities.
This is Foucault's famous point. The sodomite was a temporary sinner; anyone could commit the act. But from the 19th century on, the person who engaged in that act was seen as a separate species.
The homosexual.
The homosexual, a fixed type of person with a fixed abnormal biology.
And once you have that category, you need a taxonomy.
Yeah.
The term homosexual is coined in 1868.
Yeah.
But here is the great irony.
It's one of the best ironies in this whole story. The term heterosexual was also initially coined to describe a sexual perversion.
Most people don't know that. How was it a perversion?
Well, James G. Kiernan first used it in 1892, and he defined it as the perversion of having sex for recreational pleasure rather than for procreation.
So if you were a heterosexual, in the original sense, you were a deviant obsessed with pleasure.
That was the idea. The term we now consider the absolute definition of normal was, for its first few decades, a label for a sexual deviant. It wasn't until the 1920s that heterosexual fully became the morally superior normative category we know today.
It just shows how unstable these categories were at their birth.
Very unstable. And all this pathologizing led to the sexual inversion model, the idea that gay men were women trapped in men's bodies and lesbians were men in women's bodies.
But no matter how they defined it, the consensus was that homosexuals were biologically different. They weren't sinners to be punished anymore.
They were abnormal individuals who needed a cure.
And this idea was incredibly persistent.
Incredibly. Homosexuality was officially a mental illness in the U.S. until 1973, and for the World Health Organization until 1992.
And the cures were things like aversion therapy.
Yes. Used well into the 1960s. They would show a patient images of same-sex partners and simultaneously administer electric shocks or drugs to induce vomiting, trying to condition the desire out of them.
It's a dark history. The scientists who created these categories often thought they were being progressive, treating people instead of jailing them. But they ended up giving the state a whole new set of tools for control.
They swapped the priest's confessional for the doctor's clinic, but the institutional power to define sexual truth remained.
So these scientific categories, they become the norm that the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s pushes back against.
Right. And this movement was really influenced by Freudian Marxists like Wilhelm Reich. He argued that sex is this natural, positive life force that's been repressed by bourgeois society.
They called it orgastic potency.
He did. He believed that repressing this energy was the root cause of neurosis and political conservatism. His idea was that sexually repressed people make for obedient, authoritarian citizens.
And then the technology catches up. The contraceptive pill comes along in 1960.
A total game changer. It finally severed sex from the near certainty of reproduction and challenged that old Freudian idea that anatomy is destiny.
But the revolution wasn't exactly a utopia of equality, was it?
Not at all. Second-wave feminists quickly launched a powerful critique, arguing that the revolution often just ended up affirming masculine sexuality.
How so?
Well, feminists like Sheila Jeffreys argued it was less about freedom for women and more about fulfilling male fantasies of female availability. Suddenly, there was this new cultural pressure on women to be sexually liberated, which made it really hard to say no without being called frigid or uptight.
So the power dynamic didn't really change.
Not as much as people hoped. This critique led directly to the politics of the female body, specifically the orgasm.
This is Ann Kucha's famous essay, The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm.
Yes, which was a direct attack on the psychoanalytic idea that a mature female orgasm had to be vaginal. She framed it as a form of male oppression, since most women need clitoral stimulation to achieve orgasm.
And then Sheer Heights surveys provided the data.
Massive amounts of data. She showed that while very few women could orgasm from intercourse alone, almost all could when stimulating themselves. She argued the problem wasn't female inadequacy, but a definition of sex that was centered entirely on male anatomy and male needs.
This all culminates in the feminist sex wars of the 1980s.
A deep philosophical split within feminism itself.
On one side, you had anti-pornography feminists like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon,
who argued that male sexuality is intrinsically linked to violence and domination. Dworkin went as far as to say that intercourse itself is an act of colonization, a political act of subordination.
And on the other side?
You had these sex-positive feminists like Gail Rubin and Lynn Segal.
And they argued what?
They rejected the idea that sex is only about male violence. They emphasized female pleasure, choice, and agency. They fought for a woman's right to define her own sexuality, including advocating for better conditions and rights for sex workers. This split, is sex fundamentally dangerous or potentially liberating, is still with us today.
And just as this war is raging, a new crisis emerges that brings back all the old associations of sex with danger.
The HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. It was a grim end to the hedonism of the early sexual revolution.
And because the disease was first identified with marginalized groups, gay men, drug users, the government response was tragically slow.
It was. There was this conservative backlash framing AIDS as a kind of divine punishment for the permissive society.
But the crisis also became a powerful mobilizing force.
It did. Gay-led organizations like ACTUP stepped into the void, pioneered the concept of safe sex, and transformed a health emergency into a political movement for gay rights.
And the crisis also revealed some deep truths about heterosexual relationships.
Yes, this is where we get the concept of the male in the head paradox.
Let's unpack that.
Well, research showed that even when women knew the risks of unprotected sex, and even when they felt protection was their responsibility, they often couldn't negotiate using a condom.
Why not?
Because they had internalized the idea of male sexual needs as these uncontrollable biological drives. To ask for a condom was to risk questioning her partner's manhood, interrupting his pleasure, or even risking violence or abandonment.
So the male in the head, this internalized idea of male desire, overrode a woman's rational choice for her own health.
Exactly. It shows how deeply these gender norms run, constraining even our most critical life or death decisions.
And this brings us back to the state and its long history of trying to manage populations through sex, which means we have to talk about eugenics.
The genetic improvement of the national stock, a movement founded entirely on the biological models we've been discussing.
And it wasn't a fringe idea.
Not at all. It had support across the political spectrum, from socialists to feminists. It was framed as this purely rational, scientific way to improve society.
It's shocking to read that Margaret Sanger, the birth control pioneer, was an enthusiastic eugenicist who called the poor human weeds.
It is, and the economic argument was powerful. Social democrats in places like Sweden and Switzerland saw forced sterilization as cost-effective, cheaper than providing long-term support for so-called degenerates.
And the application was profoundly gendered.
Overwhelmingly so. In places like Sweden and the Swiss canton of Vaud, over 90% of sterilizations were performed on women.
So it wasn't just about genetics, it was about policing female sexuality.
It targeted inferior categories like criminals and the mentally ill, but also, crucially, social deviants, unmarried mothers, prostitutes, women with loose morals.
The state was literally deciding who was fit to reproduce based on social and sexual norms.
Exactly. They even had eugenic education brochures telling young people to choose your spouse from a physically and morally healthy, mentally superior family. It was a deep, deep intrusion of the state into the most private choices, all justified by the language of science and collective good.
Which brings us to our current moment, this post-sexual revolution world.
Right. And the rise of visible LGBTQ communities and political activism, from Stonewall to ACTUP, has really undermined the old, rigid scientific categories.
So we're no longer on a continent of normality surrounded by small islands of disorder.
As Jeffrey Weeks put it, now we see clusters of islands, great and small. And a huge part of this shift was the political reappropriation of slurs like queer and dyke, turning them into symbols of defiance.
But with more diversity comes more fragmentation, even within the movement.
Of course, you had tensions under the LGBT umbrella, lesbians asking why their activism should focus on male issues like AIDS, for example. The politics became more complex.
And the intellectual frontier of this is now queer theory,
which takes the social model of sexuality and pushes it even further. Its core idea is a total rejection of fixed, binary categories, man-woman, gay-straight. It insists that all identity is socially constructed, fluid, and unstable.
So these categories aren't just descriptions. They're mechanisms of power designed to enforce normalcy.
Exactly. And the most radical expression of this is the idea of the homosexual, the postmodern sexual.
Okay, this is a concept that can be a little hard to get your head around.
It's the philosophical attempt to define your identity completely outside of those gendered constraints. If all identities are just cultural constructs, why should we feel bound by any of them?
So it's about constant fluidity.
Yes. The writer Kate Bornstein is a great example, moving from being a lesbian separatist to a dominatrix to falling in love with a trans woman, having a sex change to become a man, and then realizing he was a gay man.
That journey breaks every single traditional link between anatomy, gender, and desire.
It's the ultimate rejection of the whole scientific taxonomy of fixed types. But of course, this level of fluidity has triggered a huge counterattack from the older models.
We're seeing a major revival of the religious model.
A huge one. The rise of the Christian right, groups advocating for reparative therapy to cure gay people. It shows that the idea of sex as a sin is far from dead.
And at the same time, the biological model is back in a big way.
The search for the gay gene, the medicalization of sex with drugs like Viagra, it's all part of the same trend.
And there's a paradox there.
A profound one. Biological arguments are now used both to pathologize people and to claim rights. The argument we can't help the way we are, it's innate, uses the very scientific framework that was first used to label people as deviant.
That's the state's anxiety about reproduction, the eugenic impulse. That hasn't vanished either.
No, it's just morphed. We still see worries about birth rates among immigrant groups or coerced sterilizations of low-income women. Female reproductive sexuality is still a major focus of state policy.
So that all comes back to Foucault's point.
It does, that sexuality is a dense transfer point for relations of power. The early hope that sexual liberation would just get rid of all power structures, that's faded.
So the question isn't whether we can have total sexual freedom.
The question is what range of diversity a culture will tolerate and what it will outlaw or pathologize. Power never disappears. It just changes its methods. So to kind of synthesize this whole journey, we've moved through these three enduring models of sex, and all three are still with us.
They are. The moral religious model of sin, the biological model of instinct and disease, and the social political model of identity and power.
They all influence our laws, our medicine, and even our most private thoughts about ourselves.
We've gone from a world obsessed with status and performance to a world obsessed with internal identity and desire. And while we have more fluidity and choice now, the attempts to break free from norms just seem to create new ones.
Exactly. There are always new maps, new rules, new ways of defining ourselves. We're always negotiating these new boundaries.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought for you to take away.
Given that sexuality is such a central part of your modern identity, and that even the most radical attempts to escape categories like the homosexual just end up creating new labels,
right.
If all of our sexual truths and identities are culturally and historically constructed, does that realization make the personal experience of that identity any less real or profound for the person living it?
That's the question.
And you have to decide for yourself what constraints, moral, biological, or social feel most defining in this liquid, contested world of modern sex.
Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.